So you've had your eye on one of those cute little rangefinder cameras from Germany, but you don't want to commit a felony to get one. So what if I told you that there was a way to get all metal construction, that wonderful small rangefinder form factor, and wonderful lenses for about $50? You'd say, come on Isaac, you gotta be tricking, man. But I'm being serious. You just have to look east. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Fed 2. So like almost everyone else, I've admired Leica rangefinder cameras for as long as I've been into the hobby of photography. And after spending many nights breaking out in cold sweats, trying not to buy an actual Leica, I settled on a Fed 2 Leica clone, just to see what the fuss was all about. Now you can see that it doesn't look exactly like any of the Leicas, but they definitely took their design cues, and many of the features are almost identical. So the camera is substantially a clone of the German Leica counterpart, and I can already see the comments coming in, hey, you pronounced Leica wrong. I don't care, I pronounce a lot of things wrong. I don't get an oil change, I get an oil change. I don't carry things to the car, I pack them to the car, I don't care. But the fact that these were Leica clones means that these cameras today represent an incredible value for you and me. And I'm not sure Leica minded too much. I guess it's really hard to enforce intellectual property law when you have a country that's basically starving its population. If they're not gonna stop starving their population, they're probably not gonna stop making these cameras. If you get on eBay, you can snag a Fed 2 for about $50, or the amount of money it takes to go to Applebee's twice. But just like going to Applebee's, the question that you gotta ask yourself is it any good? So let's talk a little bit about the background of the camera. One of the most interesting things about this camera is its country of manufacture. The camera was manufactured starting in the 1950s in the Soviet Union, which is notable because it no longer exists, despite Vladimir Putin's wishes to the contrary. Those are just the facts. Don't poison me, Vladdy. Don't poison me. Guys, if I fall out of a window in my house and die, we know what happened. That got dark. The Fed factory was located in Ukraine, most notably the city of Kharkov, which you probably remember from the news where a lot of war crimes were happening. The Russian company Fed was founded by a gentleman by the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky, who would later go on to have such amazing accomplishments as founding the NKVD, or what amounts to the Russian secret police. The NKVD would go on to become the KGB, so yeah, Felix Dzerzhinsky maybe should have stayed with cameras, man. Why'd you gotta be a dickhead? And how did they make these cameras? Largely on the backs of exploited, orphaned children. So that's super cool. Another fun fact is I bought this camera from a seller in Ukraine. So it's really weird for me to think about what happened to the seller of this camera or what this camera's been through. What an insane thing to have happened. But anyway, I digress. They made these cameras from 1955 till about 1970, and turns out they made 1.5 million of them, so they really had those orphans working hard. Tons of these cameras out there, and that's why the prices are still so low. Looking at the camera itself, this is the Fed 2, which would suggest that there was a Fed 1 that preceded it. I know there's also a Fed 3 and a Fed 4. I bought the Fed 2 because it looked the coolest. Simple as that. Loading and unloading film in this camera is really super easy. If you look, there are two bolts at the bottom of the camera. You flip it over and you just turn these sideways, and that will allow the bottom to come off, and then you can access the film chamber. You'll have to thread the film up in there. One thing that is great about this camera is when I've put film into the bottom, it doesn't have to be trimmed in any way. And I know that's not always the case for old Leicas. Sometimes you have to cut the leader a little bit to make it fit inside the camera. That wasn't the case here. The film just worked. Look at that. The Russians improving on the Leica designs. If you look at the top of the camera, you've got all the usual suspects in terms of controls, although they are a little bit weird and bear some explanation. This little dial in the center is a shutter speed dial, and you can see that it has shutter speeds ranging all the way from 30 to 500th of a second. Well, you're gonna wanna bear that shutter speed in mind when you're deciding which film to load into the bottom of the camera, because being limited to only 500th of a second is really gonna be prohibitive if you put a faster speed film in there. Not gonna be any Portrait 800, Portrait 400 might even be a stretch sometimes, because you're not gonna be able to scrub that extra shutter speed off if you need to. So something to be mindful of. On the slow end as well, you can only go down to a 30th of a second, but the camera does have a bulb mode. The big chunky knob all the way to the right is your film advance knob, and it's also got a frame counter on it as well. Something that's worth noting about that frame camera is it has to actually be manually reset after you finish your roll of film, so it will count your exposures for you, but you do have to reset it after each roll. So after you finish your roll, you're gonna wanna zero that out and start back over. I have to say that in my experience, twisting the film advance knob feels very weird. I don't love it. You can also see that there's a third way to make adjustments on that third knob, and that is a really unusual film reminder disc. You can see the little bumps raised on that film reminder disc, and that is to remind you what color temperature film you're shooting. Rather simple now, almost everything is daylight balanced. But it doesn't actually input anything into the camera. It's just a reminder disc, so you know what you've got inside the camera. Something that's interesting to note though are the Cyrillic symbols located around the disc. These numbers are using something called the GOST scale, which I have no idea how it works, but it was something that the Soviet Union instead of the Kelvin scale that the rest of the world uses. Those crazy Russians. This little knob over on the left of the camera with the rotating arrow is the rewind knob. So after you finish a roll of film, you're gonna use that knob to rewind your roll of film. All right guys, if you've watched the video this far, there's one thing that's really important about the operation of this camera that you absolutely have to know. And this is unique to Russian rangefinder cameras. It's something you really need to pay attention to this part of the video or you're gonna F up your camera. Due to the unique way that these Russian rangefinder cameras work, you must cock your shutter before you make any changes to shutter speed. So what that means in practical terms is don't turn this dial before you turn this one. So you need to make sure that you cock your shutter, get to the next frame, and before you make any changes to shutter speed. Best case scenario is if you get that out of order, you're gonna have inconsistent exposure for your next couple of frames. Worst case scenario is you're gonna mess up your camera really bad and you're just gonna have to get a new one. Because trust me, there's hardly anyone in the United States working on these old cameras, so you're gonna have to get a new one. So that is something that you're gonna absolutely have to know. Do not change your shutter speed without first cocking the shutter. You've been warned. On the front of the camera, although I don't think mine really works properly, is a timer. So you can actually rotate this little lever. So that's gonna usually allow you to achieve some sort of automatic timing. One more thing on top of the camera, you obviously have your shutter button. You have a threaded shutter button. It's also worth noting that before you can rewind the film, you need to change this little adjustment on the shutter button from the C mode, which is the camera mode, to the B mode, which is, don't know, the ball-in mode. So you need to twist that, and that's gonna unlock the rewind feature on the camera and allow you to rewind the film. Talking a little bit about the lens mount on the camera, this is the Leica M39 mount. It's a screw mount. You can see I'm twisting the lens off right here. And it's nice and simple, super easy to work. You just wanna make sure that you have your lens properly threaded. You just wanna be really careful when you're threading your lens onto that lens mount and make sure that you're not cross-threaded. So that way you don't damage the camera lens. But your lens just twists right back on. And this camera is compatible with any Leica M39 screw mount lens. And there are a ton of lenses available for the system. And if you wanna stay with those cheap and cheerful Russian manufactured options, there are lots of those lenses available as well. From Russian companies like Industar, which this is an Industar lens right here, but also Jupiter makes some really cool lenses as well. So you're gonna wanna check some of those out. The lens that's actually featured on a lot of these cameras, including mine, is the Industar 61. And it is just as simple of a lens as you can imagine. It's a 50mm lens, f2.8 at the wide end. You can adjust that really easily by twisting this front ring. So all the way down to f22 and then all the way back to f2.8. And that doesn't lock, so it's just kind of loose on there. But you can see in the middle of the lens, there's also a focusing scale if you're the kind of smarty pants that knows actually how to read one of those. And then on the back of the lens, you actually have the focusing. This is the big chunky grippy. You're just gonna rotate that left and right, and you can see that the lens design is collapsible, so it's extending as you're focusing. In terms of removing the lens, I usually try to grip it in the center. The focusing ring's obviously loose, the aperture ring is obviously loose, but that center focusing scale is locked in place. You can just grab it by the middle ring and then twist. The lens itself, that Industar 61, is a really high quality lens, really nice optics. It's a clone of a Zeiss design, so you're gonna get really great images out of that. All glass lens elements, obviously, and the lens itself has aluminum machining. Another little weird quirky thing about the camera is the tripod foot used on the camera. You're gonna have to buy an adapter to be able to use one of the 1/4 tripod things that we use in the United States. This is a 3/8 size. You're gonna want a 1/4 converter. So that's really an overview of the camera. What is there to say about the Fed 2? Well, it's built extremely well. You look at the camera, it's made out of aluminum, everything on it is metal. It's a fantastic looking camera as well. I mean, you can tell where they got their inspiration. It very much looks like a Leica 2 or a Leica 3. Fantastic looking camera. And it feels really nice in hand. It's got some heft to it. You can say what you want about it being from Russia or being made by orphans or whatever, but the camera really feels great in the hand, and it's super small and compact. It's got that really tiny rangefinder form factor and just feels great. I've went through some of the weirdness about this camera. There are a few quirks, but it's nothing that you can't overcome. And to be honest, I went through the deal with winding your shutter before you adjust your shutter speed. I think that most of us will find that to be pretty natural operation anyway. I made it sound like it's a big dramatic thing. Best practice for using this camera is after you take a shot, just wind it again, right? And that needs to be your habit. I think most of us do that anyway, but to make sure that this camera continues to operate and you don't mess it up, that's something that you're gonna wanna do. There are other little weird quirks to the camera. That tripod foot, for example, loading is a little strange, especially the first couple of times that you do it. But all in all, it's a great looking old camera. And I mean, it works like a camera, it works great. And these lens designs represent just incredible values. There are a couple of other Leica lens clones out there that you're gonna be able to obtain. Some of the old Elmar designs, the collapsible lens designs, I know those exist from some of those Russian manufacturers as well. So lots of lenses available, specifically cheap Russian lenses, but also the in-house Leica lenses are still out there as well for you to use if you've got that kind of money. I would ask why you'd be interested in shooting a fed rangefinder camera if you're buying Leica lenses, but I digress. So who's this camera for? I think it's for somebody, well, like me in the situation that I was in. You wanted to have a Leica camera, you wanted to try a Leica camera, but before you threw down the $3,000 for an M6 or something like that, you wanted to try one out. This provides a really nice entry point into a rangefinder camera system for not a lot of money. Looks great, slides into a camera bag nice and easy. You can take it with you and hardly even know it's there. So if you're thinking about trying out a rangefinder, I would suggest something like this. You can learn the rangefinder focusing system with the camera and get a feel for what using one of these old cameras is all about at a very low price point. But if you're not looking for an old mechanical rangefinder and you're looking for something a little bit more modern, maybe even from outer space, check out my review of the Contax G1. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.